let's dive right in. I'm Ronnie Mitra. One thing I wanted to cover quickly, I work for this company, Layer 7, and it's actually my fault we don't have a banner. At the last conference I was at, we were supposed to get it shipped over here, and it never managed to get here. So this is the company I work for. If you're not sure what we do, we produce API management products. So all of the things around rate limiting, security, registration, all these pieces, that's what we do. I'm not here to talk about that product. I'm actually not on the product team or the sales team. I work in something called the API Academy. So this is part of Layer 7. It's myself and my colleague Mike Amundsen, whose name was mentioned earlier. And what we're trying to do is improve the state of API design by coming to conferences like this, by talking about APIs, by doing research, by writing, by making tutorial videos, all of this stuff. Myself, I'm actually based in London, okay, in England. So I have a strong focus on Europe. It's really exciting to see what's happening this year with API conferences in our region, right? Events like this and the follow-up events that are going to take place. It seems like we've got the appetite now. There's real community action happening, so that's good. So over the last few months, I've been focusing on the area of interaction, right, when I'm not doing my regular work. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about for 25 minutes. So this kind of silly title, the I is for interaction. It's not true, obviously, right? We know that API stands for Application Programming Interface, but that's not the point. It's a catchy title to provoke you. What I'm trying to say is that there's more to this than just publishing interfaces, right? That we should be focusing on the concepts of interaction and the study of interaction design. Interaction design has its roots in the era of industrial design, right? So it's the idea of taking this approach to products where we don't simply design a product to achieve functional value, but the designer thinks about how the product might be used by a human and applying this idea to technology, right? So the way that humans interact with technology. And it's really changed the way that we look at software, and we've had companies that build a reputation on this, and we've seen whole new generations of website design based on this idea. You'll hear other terms that fall under the same theme, right? You might talk about usability or HCI, human-computer interaction, user experience design, right? Goal-oriented design is a methodology. If these things are familiar, then you're understanding this world. All of this space has one thing in common. There's a common theme uniting it, and that's having a user-centric view of product design. Right? Again, not designing products simply to achieve function, but for actual interaction. You can't help study this space without reading this book, right? It's what brought a lot of these concepts into the mainstream for us. Donald Norman's excellent book, The Design of Everyday Things, where he details the minor annoyances that we all face as we interact with objects in our lives, right? And then he goes on to explain how proper design can be used to reduce these annoyances and achieve great design. Anyone who's read this book will never look at doors the same way, right? These simple objects that should help us move from room to room, from space to space, end up becoming objects where we intensely think about how they might be used. So simple things like the placement of a handle or how the handle looks can give us cues to how that object works. Right, so I grabbed just a photo of a door off of Flickr, and we can see obviously the designer had some interest in beauty, right? They wanted to make a lovely heart-shaped handle. But what the handle doesn't tell us is whether the door gets pushed or pulled, right? So when you come up to, you have to kind of figure that out. If the handle was in the middle of the door, we wouldn't know which axis it swings on. Slightly better design, but not as beautiful, is this door that's more functional. Right? We have, if you can't see it at the back, it has handles that look like they should be pulled. And the handles are closer together in the middle, so we know the door swings this way. because I was doing this presentation, I was thinking about doors again, because you can't stop. And I arrived at the airport last night, and as I was walking through Arlanda, I came to a point, there's no one in front of me. I was one of the last off the plane. And I came to a room where there was a door to the lift on the right and a glass wall in front of me. And I didn't know what to do next. I was stuck. There was an arrow saying, arrivals, pointing to the wall. So I tentatively took a step towards the wall. It turns out the wall is a door and it slid away. But how would I have known, right? There was no cues. So in these stories about everyday life, these little things we all go through that just take a few seconds but are minor annoyances, we can start to understand that well-designed products are the ones that are easier to use. They give us pleasure, right? And they're simpler, less complex. We can take these ideas and apply them to web APIs. People have applied those ideas to software products. They've applied them to mobile phones, and we should be able to apply them to web APIs as well. Because after all, good design matters for us, right? That's why we spend time at conferences like this, to learn these crafts, to learn these skills. When I think of what we want as goals for API design, it's usually these three things, right? We want frictionless integration. This is what we've been promised. We were promised it back 10 years ago, and it wasn't really happening, and it's starting to happen now, that it should be easier for systems to connect. If we're publishing public APIs, we want growth, so we want high rates of adoption. Fine. And if we're doing private APIs, the closed ones between business partners, we want lower costs for integration. We want to bring partners on quickly. So it becomes, again, obvious that good design can help us achieve these goals, right? The two are one and the same. And who are our users? Our users are the developers building apps to work with our APIs. So we start to hear this term, and this is not my own term, but it's starting to gain resonance, right? This idea of developer experience. We've heard about UX forever, and now API designers are starting to think about DX. How do we improve the developer experience? In a way, it's the formalization of things that have been known intuitively by us. And if we start to explore what that means, at the simplistic level, we have two interaction surfaces, right? This interaction between a developer and our portal, the human component, that lets them learn about your API, figure out how to use it, register to use it, have that self-service agreement, but also an interaction between the app they build and your API at runtime. There are more interactions than this, right? There's the interaction between the administrator and the portal, the user and the app, the user and your gateway in some cases. But these two interactions are our main focus. So if this is all true, then why isn't everyone doing this already? Why isn't every API designed in a perfect way that just seemed natural to us as users? I've been able to identify 4 basic reasons that I think are challenges in this space. The first one is that we project our own perspective when we design an API. Right? Typically, we're not starting from scratch. If we are, we're lucky. Very few of us take that interface first approach, right? Instead, we're starting with something like this. We have object models, data models, business processes, so many moving parts and so many things to understand. There's a complexity. But then as we go on and build our API with all of this in our mind, clouding how we're building our interface, we publish it and realize that the developer cannot see behind the curtain. They only see the API. Right? This is the extent of their perspective. So it's important to understand this mantra and remember it. Your code is not your API, right? And your data is not your API. You need to focus purely on the interface that enables these interactions. A second reason it's difficult to design is that we tend to project our own biases when we're designing interfaces, right? In the same way that the person who designed that door loved the shape of a heart, but wasn't necessarily thinking about usage. They projected their biases of beauty. You know, you'll hear it mentioned a few times that, let's say we shouldn't use the SOAP protocol, or SOAP is a bad idea, or, you know, no one uses SOAP anymore. And you're dumb if you do. But why do we say that, right? And I do think there's reasons why a SOAP-style API might not make sense. But we really need to think about the impact of taking these statements and applying them to the API you design. So let's consider an everyday object type case, keyboards. I don't think I'm telling you anything new when I talk about the way we came up with this layout for a keyboard, right? The QWERTY keyboard. It's almost become common knowledge. It's a piece of pub trivia that when the typewriter was originally invented, you know, this mechanical thing, probably only half of you have ever used one at this point, right? But for those of you who do, you know that the hammers hit a ribbon of ink and it leaves a mark on the paper. The challenge was this was a mechanical object, and when typists would use it too quickly, the machine would jam. So this QWERTY keyboard layout is designed to slow users down. It's designed to not be as usable as it could be. Okay? So that's the QWERTY keyboard. Maybe less of you are familiar with this keyboard layout, the Dvorak keyboard. Okay? And the Dvorak keyboard layout is designed to be faster and easier to use. The most common letters are sitting on the home row, so your fingers don't have to move as much when you type English words. So if I asked you to design a keyboard for a laptop that I was producing today, which keyboard would you choose? Knowing that the Dvorak keyboard is better, you would still likely choose the QWERTY keyboard, right? And that's because you know that's what users would expect. It would be familiar to them. It would be difficult for them to learn this new keyboard layout, and furthermore, difficult for them to learn it and then use other products they own. We can apply that same logic. And to simplify it, you know, I can say kind of in a cheeky way, it doesn't matter that you don't like SOAP. Who cares? Who cares what you like or don't like? What matters is what your developer base thinks. The people who will use your API. How familiar are they with SOAP or HTTP-based, you know, object-style APIs or Hypermedia? Right, so an example might be if I'm designing an API that I know enterprise developers will use, let's say in Germany, and I know they're only going to be comfortable with SOAP, I might use a SOAP-based API. It fits, it makes sense. A third reason we have difficulty with design is we make bad assumptions as well, right? And this is because we're actually not building everyday objects, are we? We're building complex systems that only talented and educated people generally can understand, right? And it turns out that we are also developers, right? Generally, if you're building an API, you also know how to use APIs. So you start to make assumptions about how all this works, and that can cloud your judgment when it comes to design. It's difficult to put yourself in another person's shoes if you already think you're wearing those shoes, right? And lastly, often we lack the time and money required for this type of design. We know what we should do, but we're limited by business reasons, right? We can't afford to do all the right things. In some cases, when you have these limitations, you end up following things like best practices. These become shortcuts, right? So you learn how other people are doing it, the APIs you like, you model yourself after that. And I think that's a valid way to move forward. It's a good shortcut. But you can also get caught up in your own world of constraints in that case. You pick a pattern, you pick a style that you think you want to follow, and then you can end up thinking to yourself, am I restful enough? Right? On the Roy Fielding scale of floating heads, how many do I get? 3.5, because you don't have Hypermedia links. So it's better to shift the perspective away from that and more towards the developers, right? Ultimately, that's how we can do better at this as a group. While realizing that this takes effort and diligence. It's not enough just to say, oh, now I'm going to be developer-centric, right? Because we all start by saying that. That's the easy part. The harder part is to do the work. And to be developer-centric means that We need our mental models to be the same. When you design your API, you have a mental model of what that interface looks like. And often it contrasts from the mental model of your user. So your API ends up looking like a triangle, and your developer is thinking square, and he has to adapt to that triangle, right? We want to start from the same mental model, from our user's perspective. Effectively design with your developer in mind. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing we can do is just ask them, right? Reach out to our developer base and find out. I'm actually really happy about the order of these presentations. I thought Tobias's work that they're doing in public radio is a great example of asking your user base, right? They have a user forum. They're actively engaging and finding out. This is the kind of thing you want to do. The other good news is we're not the first to try and build products that focus on interaction. So many have done it before us. And our brethren in web design do things like conduct interviews. They invite people into offices and ask them, you know, what do you like? What do you dislike? And they use that as part of their design methodology. We can do surveys, right? We don't have to talk to people in person. We can broadcast out a list of questions. And there's an art to doing these things. You can look for public data. There's public survey information available about what developers like. But just make sure you're getting information about the right developers, about the ones you care about. And the third thing we can do is listen, and not just in a physical way, but virtually, right? We're in an era where there's so many people blogging and telling us what they think and how they feel. All that information is available to you. Just don't make the mistake of assuming that whoever's talking loudest is the person you need to listen to. Sometimes the art is finding the right people to listen to. So whenever we start talking about getting feedback from users, someone inevitably will pull out this quote that Henry Ford apparently said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. The idea being that users cannot enunciate, they can't articulate what you should design. They can only express their pains, their challenges, and again, their perspective, right? It's up to you as a designer to connect those dots. So to help with that, you can take additional steps, right? In addition to simply asking and listening, you can observe. You can watch the way developers build applications. There's a lot of developer code publicly available. You can look at that. Try and understand how your developer base builds applications for APIs. I think more importantly, you can do things like prototyping. Prototyping in our world means building interfaces without actual code running behind it, right? Focus on what that interface will look like with maybe simulated data. Don't worry so much about how it's going to connect to your real systems, and then try it out. Ideally, let your target audience try it out, right? And then finally, we have the concept of historical data. Being able to look at usage patterns and applying those usage patterns to how your API works. If you go from a version 1 to a version 2, like we heard, you can use historical data and usage metrics to understand, hey, what worked, what didn't? You know, are we hitting the audience we want to, or are we not? Two other real examples I can give you quickly. We have a customer in the UK who primarily does business-to-business integration. And I asked him, how do you ensure that your API fits your user base? And he said, well, it's simple. For one of the APIs, the guy who builds the application sits next to the guy who's building the API. Right? So he gets feedback immediately if he does something that the app owner doesn't like. I mean, that's an ideal scenario, right? A second situation with the public API, there's a company called Box.com. They're a Dropbox type file storage. And they have a pretty good API. But one of the things I was really impressed with is they primarily target the enterprise audience. When they went from their version 1 to version 2, they looked at their usage data and realized that SOAP API that they published because they assumed their enterprise developers would love wasn't being really used by that enterprise developer crowd. In fact, they were all moving to the HTTP object-based API. So they killed the SOAP API, cleaned up their interface, made it simpler, knowing that they were doing what their developer audience wanted. Right? That's how you should be making your decisions. Ultimately, we're talking a lot about the interface specifically, but you need to think about all aspects of the developer experience. So that's registration, security, troubleshooting, right? How are errors handled, learning, which is a massively overlooked piece usually, as well as the interface itself. Right? So if we think about registration, what can we learn from the world of the web? Lazy registration is something I don't see enough of in the web API space. I should be able to do as much as I can with your API before you make me sign my name in blood. Right? Social integration, there probably isn't enough of. Signing in with a GitHub account and you can pull in my applications and see those kinds of metrics. Personalization is another one. Ultimately, there's an activity cycle for this kind of interaction that's slightly different from the way I might use this projector, right? When I walk up to this projector, I push a button, I get immediate feedback. For a developer, they need to learn about our API, code an application, implement it, test it, and then make changes, which is challenging. From a picture point of view, it means they're learning with our portal, coding an app, and then testing. If we could shorten that so that our human developer, remember that top layer of interaction, can interact directly with our runtime API, we get a closer feedback loop and we can do something really powerful, right? And that's why we see such a rise in popularity of API explorers, dashboards, live documentation, APIs through the browser like we heard about. In terms of interface style, this becomes important as well. This idea, I have to use an HTTP GET to write to your API, that feeling, that emotional reaction is similar to walking up to a door and not knowing whether to push or pull, that annoyance, right? And we don't want our developer audience to have those kinds of emotional reactions. We want them to feel pleasure. And then taking it even further, we have Hypermedia, which seems to fit into this world so well from a machine perspective. We can enable strategies to work with APIs. We can have full interaction between apps and APIs without humans. As well as with security, and I'll quickly go over this one because it's kind of funny to say the word easier and OAuth 2, but it is easier than OAuth 1. And I want to make the point, OAuth 2, I think, is harder for us as publishers to implement, but is much easier for developers. I've done both, and I much prefer implementing a client system with OAuth 2. So how do we do all this? At a really high level, we need to start by identifying our target audience, learn about them, make design decisions that apply to that audience, right? Choose your architectural style, choose your message formats based on the audience you're trying to attract. And then prototype, get feedback, and iterate, right? Keep evolving. If we focus on interactions that take place, rather than simply the interface we're putting out, we're setting the stage for great design, right? This is our best path. It's kind of natural. It's hard not to design something very well if you're thinking about it from the user's perspective. Okay, so I think I just about hit time. I could maybe take one question if there is one. Go ahead.
How far would you say that the developer reaches into, to the API itself rather than the API SDK? In terms of, the developer sees the square while the publisher sees the triangle, but what I'm asking is the developer actually trying to see the triangle, or it stops at...
No, we should assume that the onus is on us as publishers to move our mental model towards the developers, right? The idea of that picture is the developer arrives at the interface with a concept in mind based on their own biases, their own familiarity. And we can expect that to change, but the cost of that change is this friction. So the best systems, the best designed products and interfaces are the ones that look more like what the developer wants. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay, before I walk away, I just wanted to do one last plug, if that's all right. The thing that I'm passionate about within Layer 7 is this site that we just launched called apiacademy.co. We're hoping this will become a free resource for you. You're the audience, right? To get video tutorials on API design topics. I've got one up here on the interaction model. They're short, 5 minutes. We're going to have blocks. We're hoping to put up some ebooks, right? So maybe later tonight, when you get a chance, bookmark this or put it in your browser history. And I would really, really love to get feedback on this. It's a new thing we've launched. I want to know if we're doing the right thing. So I'm trying to make, get user-centered design with this site as well. So let me know if it works or not, if it fits your needs. All right, thank you very much.